Story. Since the dawn of time, humans, that's us, have been telling stories, painting on the walls of caves those bison we saw that one time, carving a shitty self-portrait into stone, or creating tapestries of that one time our dumbass king fell off his stupid horse. Look at that retard. Story has been an integral part of how humans learn, love, engage, excite, and spread political messages through propaganda. Yet despite this millennial-long connection with story, some games seem adamant not to include any at all, deliberately foregoing story in an epic rebellious act. Unfortunately, most of the games that go down this route fail because they are boring and shit. But they also fail because, well, why am I here? Recently, I've been playing Proteus, a new boomer shooter produced by Bounding Box Software. The visceral combat is top tier. The guns are unique yet reminiscent of other games in the genre. Plus, the visuals are so tightly tuned. No matter how much blood or guts or explosions are on screen, I never really lose my place or where the enemy is. But about 4 hours in, standing atop a giant chasm that was recently filled with acid, staring down into the abyss filled with techno-marvel nonsense on what must be an alien world to Earth, wielding a strange fusion gun powered by an esoteric source of energy, thinking about the demonic portals harnessed by technology that I arrive and indeed leave this place in, and I'm filled with one question. Well, actually, a bunch of questions. What is this shit? Who the fuck am I? Where am I? What am I doing? Who am I doing it to? Why am I doing any of this? Where am I going? There's a map screen, but all the names are the first thing you would think to call the mission, or the level, I suppose. This place where there's a sniper aiming down at you from a tower during the whole mission? That's called Marksman. Get it? Because he's a marksman? This place that has a giant rotating drill? That's called Excavation. Oh, hey look, a terminal. Thank God. Maybe this will have some context as to what is going on. Oh, it's just thanking the people who supported the game on Kickstarter. Thank God, I thought I might get some context here. There's even an entire level featuring a bunch of their faces encased in 3D for all time, like that one season trailer for Game of Thrones. I didn't watch the show because I have good taste, but I remember the marketing. That's how creepy it is. Weird way to thank your supporters. There's no explanation for my trajectory here. I came from somewhere and I'm heading somewhere else, but I've no idea where I came from or where I'm going and why I'm taking the route I am. It's like waking up from a coma riding a roller coaster blindfolded. So when I got to the second world in Proteus, and I was even more lost now than I was before, I just got frustrated, and I got so angry I wrote this entire video in 10 seconds. This is why games need stories to succeed. Or why some games need at least a little story in order to succeed. Well, in order to have a better chance at succeeding. Fuck it. Let's just call it why I would prefer it if more boomer shooters implemented at least a little story. Roll the intro!
Our interest in their world was pure for the benefit of mankind. Everything has clearly gotten out of hand now, yes. But it was worth the risk, I assure you.
In 1973, 3 high school students working in the NASA Ames Research Center were trying to develop a program to visualize fluid dynamics for spaceships. When I was in high school, I just figured out how to host a Minecraft server, but okay. Instead of creating the technobabble nonsense, they created what is widely regarded as the first-person shooter, Maze War. But nobody knew anything about it, and it was kinda shit, so let's move on to Wolfenstein 3D. A lot of people incorrectly assume that Wolfenstein 3D invented the concept of the FPS, but it was at least 20 years late to that party. Some people, also even more incorrectly, assume Doom invented it, but they're really stupid because that's even further away. That's how slow game development was in the early days. The first in a genre can be offset by most cultural perception as 20 years off. 20 years ago from today, we didn't even have battle passes in our games. I mean, could you imagine living like that? I know I could. Wolfenstein wasn't even the first game to use 3D texture mapping and raycasting, so it's not even the first game to have that visual style. Wolfenstein, however, took the elements that had already been invented by other games and brought them together to create the first modern FPS. Modern is in quotations, for good reasons, because it's no longer modern, it's like 30 years old. And yes, the footage I'm using for Wolfenstein here is from The New Order. Shut the fuck up. Much like how Medal of Honor Allied Assault set the standard for the war shooter, despite not being the first, Wolfenstein 3D set the standard for FPS titles. Thankfully, nostalgia and an industry that refuses to learn has allowed some developers to remain stuck in the early 1990s, where somehow pressing a button in a menu and spawning in a corridor counts for a good start to the game. We've moved past the limitations of old technology and can now tell stories through our games efficiently, quickly, and relatively cheaply. I mean, voice actors are fucking everywhere. The reason video games back then couldn't use voice actors was because they didn't have sound to play with. No, really, sound cards were needed to generate, process, and output sound. One of the first ever sound cards was an Ad-Lib music synthesizer card from 1990, and it sounded like this. Computers were not initially envisioned as a way to achieve entertainment or play video games, so their ability to play sound was an optional extra, unless they were really designed to make sounds from the start, like consoles were. So no wonder that 2 years after the Ad-Lib music synthesizer bleeped its first bloops, the developers of Wolfenstein elected to not put in much voice acting in their game, as gamers were unlikely to have anything that could play the sounds back. As for text, well, where do you put it? Whilst today's 1080 and 1440p standard resolutions might be more than enough to display quite a bit of the Bible, back in the early 2000s, resolutions were quite different. Whilst early statistics are hard to find, most stats websites indicates that the vast majority of users had resolutions well below 1280 by 960, with UTexas and OneStats showing between 25 to 37% of users using 800 by 600. You'd barely be able to put up that one part of the Bible that says eating shellfish is gay. So you don't have the screen real estate nor the sound cards to actually display much story at all. So no wonder they focused on the gameplay entirely, picking enemies that are their own context. You don't really need much story for you to go kill demons or Nazis. They kind of self-explained why they're villains and why you should kill them. Furthermore, the concept of story in video games was still super early. Sure, we all knew, as soon as video games got beyond the Pac-Man and Donkey Kong stage, the concept of telling story would be integrated. But let me remind you, in the 90s, when Doom and Wolfenstein came out, that stage was still going on. It was barely ending. The Secret of Monkey Island was published the same year as the first Bleep Bloop machine, and one of the first ever commercially successful graphic adventure games, King's Quest, was only released 6 years earlier. In the funny year. We can learn from the older generations, for sure. In film, for instance, Battleship Potemkin was a great film for the time that has inspired plenty of movies since. But we've evolved beyond silent films at this point. We've moved on from hurling babies down a giant set of stairs, for the most part. We are well past characters being introduced with a random, out-of-context shot in the middle of a scene. We've moved past those times, and frankly, we shouldn't adhere to them at all. So why are game developers limiting themselves artificially in the avenues of storytelling as well, like on purpose? Some people talk about sandbox creativity, but this is removing the sand from the sandbox. It's not just being creative with storytelling by limiting the tools. There is no storytelling. You're limiting the product, not just your form of creation. There is stuff to be learned from the older generations, like I said. Half-Life, like I talked about in my Call of Duty video, can teach us a lot about how story and world should intersect. But again, I think most people realize, at least subconsciously, that for storytelling in FPS games, there was a time before and a time after Half-Life 1. Half-Life 1 was by no means the first game to introduce story to an FPS game, nor was it the first high-profile game with a story. Hell, it probably wasn't even the first high-profile FPS game with a story, but Half-Life set the stage for a more grounded approach to storytelling in gaming than we had ever seen before. It changed the game, literally, thanks to its brand new 3D animation technology. It took the systems established in the brand new Quake engine and elevated it to new heights with new technology. Suddenly, people could have characters talk and their lips could move. Suddenly, guns were no longer floating a foot off the ground and spinning, but laying on the ground. It was the first FPS game to not just tell a story, but to invite you into a world with context, meaning, depth, and a grounded reality. The levels weren't just pointless nonsense like they were in Quake or Doom. They were test chambers with blast pits and surgical robots. The first hour of Half-Life on its own grounded you in a real space more than any game ever did before. I can understand wanting to return to the simpler times before Half-Life, when games barely needed any story and could rely on their mechanics alone. But the reality is we've changed. We are no longer baby boys. We are full adult boys, and we want our video games to give us story time. In the early days of filmmaking, the only sound was a dude on a piano, or at best, an orchestra. Dialogue and exposition was delivered through slides on a screen, and as a result was kept as minimal as possible to not break up the flow of the film, forcing filmmakers to use the camera, action, editing, blocking, and acting to tell the story most of the time. But now that we have sound, entire movies can be just people talking, scenes filled with nothing but intricate dialogue, and it has allowed filmmakers to become renowned specifically because they write good dialogue, like Aaron Sorkin, Quentin Tarantino, and not this fucking guy. While there is a high level of artistic value in telling the story through non-dialogue, actively not using it at all is either stupid, or you need to be really clever with how to tell your story. So why do so many game developers, specifically those making boomer shooters, actively avoid story entirely? Well, there are a lot of pitfalls when writing any story for your game, and in terms of work, there is at least a little bit of effort that has to go into creating a good story. So let's talk about why you might want to avoid it. Let's talk about the name. Let's start with the basics. When do you need a story in your game? All of the time. Thank you for watching my video. Dislike and unsubscribe. I'm kidding. But I'm also not. Dislike. I bet you're sitting there watching this video, and depending on what type of person you are, you're thinking back to games you've played before that had basically no story and thinking, but Joel, it's fine to have no story in games. And I know. There are plenty of games that don't follow what I'm about to talk about. They have absolutely no story and also have massive success, like Tetris and Pac-Man. That's kind of it though. Even Fortnite technically has a story. It has Troy Baker in it. Why? Most games that get away without having an actual story are games that are effectively the video game equivalent of a Rubik's Cube. They're puzzles, games literally described by many gamers as time wasters. If you took relatively simple or even complex puzzles and added a story to it, you get stuff like Portal, one of the best games ever made and arguably one of the very few perfect games. Or you get Myst, arguably one of the first games to ever hit the mainstream. Hbomberguy made a fantastic video on it and then locked it behind his Patreon. So that's what communism is. And then you have games like Antichamber, which is amazing, but it doesn't have a story. It's an amazing game but lacks longevity because there's no narrative to pull it that extra mile from simply excellent to legendary. You know the other two games I mentioned, but there's a half-decent chance you don't know about Antichamber. So if you're thinking games don't actually need story in order to be fun or good or even amazing, you can at the very least come along on the ride that adding story has at least the base potential of turning your game from simply good to straight up amazing. But like I said, saying your game needs a story all the time can be a bit of a misconception. Yes, but also no. Your game needs a story, sure, but sometimes the story has to come from the developer and other times it comes from the player. Both times you do get a story, which is, for larger games at least, essential. Let's build an understanding of narrative and media in general and then build to video games. As a baseline, the story is not your world and context. These are two largely separate things. You have your story, which is plot beats, narrative, dialogue, scenes, escalation, arcs, and characters, whilst your world is the context, technology, factions, terrain, and customs. Much like color theory, random colors don't match, and can frequently look like poo. The two colors I've chosen here are complementary colors, for instance. In the same way, you need your story and your world to complement one another, much like red and green does here. This is why in Lord of the Rings, for instance, Tolkien chose a group of adventurers that would show us, the readers, as much of the world as possible, from the Shire to Mordor. The story of the Lord of the Rings books complements the world of Middle-earth. In video games, your story does not have to follow any conventions of natural storytelling. You don't need a traditional 3-act structure, you don't necessarily need to follow the hero's journey. And so long as the beginning feels like a beginning and the ending feels like a conclusion to what came before, everything in between can basically be linear steps in escalating difficulty and scale. I mean, movies frequently don't follow those conventions either, and neither do books, but those are clever rule breakings rather than the literal expectation. In video games, it's a lot more common to not follow those rules at all, especially with RPGs that have side quests and multiple paths. However, like I said, your story isn't inherently connected entirely to your world, unless you tailor it very specifically. You can, in theory, rewrite your story ever so slightly, maintain the vast majority of plot points, dialogue, and characters, and set it in a completely different world and context. The Northman, Robert Eggers' latest film, is the closest adaptation of the story of Amleth, which you might know better as the story of Hamlet. Whilst Eggers draws inspiration from the original legend, Hamlet has been endlessly adapted into movies and books, all of them vastly changing the world the story takes place in, from the African savannah to ancient China to modern-day New York. Story is not world, which means you can, if you're very clever, provide the player with a world and context and allow them enough freedom to create their own story from scratch, without you having to do much to guide that experience at all. This is what games like Minecraft, Valheim, DayZ, and Shadows of Doubt aim to do. Create a world where infinite stories can take place, because the world reacts to the player's actions in a dynamic and natural way. They can get away with having next to no story thanks to their freedom for personal exploration and discovery. At best, they just need an explanation for the world itself, which is what Valheim and Shadows of Doubt start their games with. Both of them begin with a short introduction to the world as, in essence, the only written story in the game, but most of these games don't even need to do that. In Rust, you just spawn with a rock. World, however, is also a great way to kickstart or prompt many different stories. If you have an interesting and cool world to put stories in, you can very easily put lots of different stories in without needing to follow the same characters or narrative every time. Fallout, Elder Scrolls, Deus Ex, and GTA are all franchises set in broadly the same world, with minor connections between games. But the actual story being told in each game is totally different. This is why it's so frustrating that every single Star Wars spin-off inevitably rejoins with a person with the same fucking last name. World is not story, and story is not world. But those games I mentioned aren't really as open or free as the games from before. Those games can get away with giving the player no story to follow, because the world is so completely at the whim of the player's interactions with it. Whilst you can create micro-stories of your own in the latter games, they still need a story because the world isn't totally malleable. It's further towards linearity. So what if you go further down that way? What if your game is almost completely linear? What if your game follows linear progression through a series of linear levels with barely any detours at all? Well, then you need a story from the developers. Here's the comparison. My trajectory in DayZ is dictated by my own totally organic experience. I'm creating my own story using the world as a prompt, being guided by my own goal to either build a house or a base or attain objects or weapons or simply just to kill. My trajectory in New Vegas is dictated by my choices derived from the stories that Obsidian put in the game. I'm choosing my path through set points. I'm guiding the story written by someone else in the direction of my own goals within the limited purview of the game. My trajectory in Max Payne is dictated by the narrative created by Remedy Entertainment. I have no choice in the journey, and I am following Payne's story, who has a clear and objective goal of his own, to clear his name. But then you have games like Proteus from earlier. Here, I'm on the same sort of linear trajectory as Max Payne. I'm following levels in a linear fashion, following a set path created by Bounding Box Software. But there is no clear objective or goal. At the start of the game, they teleport in some imagery outside a window, and then it disappears. I assume my goal is to kill whatever that is, but I don't even know what that actually is. I don't know who I am, what I'm doing, where I am, or why I'm doing any of this instead of trying to, run away. Even AAA games can fail at fully explaining motivation like this. In Far Cry 1, 2, 3, and 4, there is a narrative explanation for why you can't just leave the area you're in. But in Far Cry 5, you're in the middle of Montana, so there's just zero explanation for why you can't just abandon Hope County and get the military. Thanks to games like Half-Life that set the standard for storytelling all those years ago, later games have had players launching the game and having questions about the story and world. If those questions are left unanswered, players will become utterly unengaged with the game they are playing. This happened to me in every other boomer shooter I've played before Proteus. At some point, I just stop and shout into the void, "Why am I here?" But again, I do have sympathy for game developers who choose not to include story, because there are a ton of pros and cons to adding story to your games. Adding story could improve your player's immersion into the world. Finding a book and choosing to read it, and learning stuff about the world could give the player a sense that this is a real space with real books. A story could increase the player's engagement with the world as well. The reason you want to clear Max Payne's name is because you know about his dead wife and child, and you know that he was framed for the murder. Plus, look at that trench coat, he looks rad. Integrating a story could also elevate the entire product. The fact that Max Payne is not only cool, but I know his wife and child got stabbed to death by lunatics that then drove him into addiction, gives me an excellent context and understanding for the world and Payne's trajectory through it.
The pills would hold the pain back for a while.
I'm not left with any questions except why Sam Lake is so fucking weird. Additionally, including story can unify parts of the gameplay with the world itself. Max Payne's ability to jump through the air in slow motion is cool, but the fact that it's explained through his addiction to popping pills gives us meaning to that ability. Suddenly, his reckless jumping isn't just calculated chaos like in Die Hard, it's reflective of his deeper, destructive personality. Plus, story can explain a lot of the weird levels and things we encounter. Why, in Max Payne 2, am I walking through a crazy weird theme park ride? Well, the context is provided by all the TVs showing a particular series about a crazy schizophrenic detective. Story has unified the gameplay with the world and created an elevated understanding of all three. If at a random point in the game you just walked through a weird theme park with no setup or explanation, you'd be really fucking confused, wouldn't you? However, adding a story has a lot of negatives too. For instance, it can distract from the point of the game. As a fan of Viking myth playing through Max Payne, I was a bit distracted every time something randomly Norse was brought up. Valkyrie drug, Ragnarok bar. It got a bit confusing because very little of it actually fits with at least my understanding of Viking myth. Adding a story also introduces another avenue for criticism. The only reason Call of Duty 2 is ranked 5th on my final rankings is because it doesn't have any story beyond the context for the game being World War II. Call of Duty 2 therefore avoids all criticisms relating to story and can live on just the quite good gameplay. Not including much of a story at all avoids any criticisms about the story being bad or having plot holes or being weird. Additionally, story can complicate development. If you take the approach of leaving story until you're finished blocking out all your levels, you now have the quite difficult job of managing what levels go in what order, what story can even be put in those levels, and how to connect them cleanly. But if you start with the story, you might end up undermining the point of the gameplay you're also developing. You end up with the grappling hook problem I talked about in my Call of Duty review. Writing a story set underground in a game which has gameplay set around a grappling hook. It will severely limit what your developers are able to do in order to commit to the story. Balancing story with gameplay is difficult as well, as you might create a story that leaves some questions tantalizingly unanswered, or you might create a story so overwhelming for the game that it totally wrecks the player's experience, either by being too linear for the type of game you're creating, or by literally overwhelming the game entirely, taking control away far too often to show off the story, or by just being totally fucking confusing, like Industria, a game that was one of my favorite games of 2021 until the game just stopped 2.5 hours in, leaving most of the big questions completely unanswered. I should make a video about that, honestly. It's such a fantastic example of how to fail in delivering your game's metaphor. But speaking of control, linear levels and linear story is at odds with the basic concept of video games, interactivity. So, should linear story exist in video games? Yes, if you do it right. Thankfully, there are a ton of ways to implement interactivity to your story without overwhelming the game itself. So, let's talk about how to Interactivity in video games is pretty important. Dare I say it's a cornerstone of video games. Dare I say it's the entire fucking point of video games. Video games turned blinking lights into tic-tac-toe, Pong, Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Doom, Half-Life, and of course current-day video games like Goblin Lord Wants Me to Become a Virgin Wizard by Managing the Brothel. Yes, that's a real game. On Steam now! The purpose was interactivity, or rather to turn board games into things on a screen. Until we realized when we were no longer tethered by our feeble human hands to move pieces, we could do much more complex things, upping the interactivity of games as we went along. Some games did start to drag though, as the innovation stopped being in gameplay things and started being in storytelling things. Cutscenes. While these days games are getting much better at starting the gameplay of the video game, very close to the start playing the video game button, some games, particularly during the late 2000s to early 2010s, had longer and longer cutscenes. Some games to this day have absurdly long cutscenes broken up with at best menu navigation, heralded as the best thing ever by people who don't actually enjoy or play video games, but use them as a replacement for Netflix binging. People who then go on to hyperfixate on the underdeveloped plots of the games in the exact same way they would with Supernatural or Sherlock, which is how we end up with shit like this image of Soap from the Modern Warfare reboots calling up Price in a video call while getting railed in the ass by Ghost. Very normal things. Since the point of video games is to press buttons and have those buttons make things occur on the screen, I think it would be best practice to not have too much overwhelming story, and the entire gaming market agreed. Soon after the 2010s, almost the entire market shifted in the same direction, as developers and publishers saw the opportunity for an untapped audience being bored to death by 14-hour cutscenes in their games. Okay, it's not quite that extreme. But it's worth noting that right after 2010, we saw a sharp rise in developers, both indie and AAA, with an increasing focus on more simple storytelling and with a bigger focus towards gameplay. Probably also speared on by the release and subsequent massive disappointment in relation to Duke Nukem Forever.
Seriously? Games developers, stop that! Really? Oh, we want you to see this. You must see it. We're gonna shove it down your throat. We're not gonna let you pass. I'm Duke Goddamn Nukem. You will get the hell out of my way.
The comment section of both of TB's videos on Duke Nukem Forever contain a lot of people pointing out that none of this is in the spirit of the original games, and that this new hyper-linear design with plenty of cutscenes was a bad move because Duke Nukem is a shooter. Specifically, what I want you to remember is one part of what Total Biscuit says next. I'll highlight it when he says it, because it is emblematic of a mindset and broadly held opinion at the time that will help contextualize what happens next.
Am I nitpicking now? It does sound like I'm nitpicking, doesn't it? It really, really does. The problem is that all of these kind of things are indicative of the new school of design around FPS, and it's awful. I just want to shoot things. Is that not okay anymore? Am I not allowed? It is not okay anymore to be a first-person shooter fan.
I don't want to say that it was here that telling the story through gameplay was invented, but it is around here that we started talking about stuff like ludonarrative dissonance in the mainstream, engaging with the relationships of gameplay and story more overtly, as well as the discussion of whether or not video games are art, reaching its first peak with the mainstream success of Journey in 2012. Anyway, in no particular order, and totally non-chronologically, 3D Realms, who had been basically dormant since 2011, started suddenly producing and publishing games that focused heavily on boomer aesthetics and seems to have had pretty good success doing so. Graven is coming out in January 2024, and they've already released games with a heavy focus on gameplay and arcade aesthetics over story with Ghost Runner and Wrath Aeon of Ruin. They also released Ion Fury, a game literally built on a modified version of the Build engine, an engine so old that I am 4 years younger than it. New Blood Interactive spawned into the world in 2014 out of a Discord collective or some shit and began publishing games that follow incredibly similar ideas. Old school game design mixed with a new school of game knowledge, a lower focus on story and a much higher focus on gameplay, with games like Dusk, Ultrakill, and Medieval being released by them in the coming years. Devolver Digital, who had already seen success in the 2010s by rebooting Serious Sam, another early 2000s boomer franchise, started publishing specifically old school retro style games. Hotline Miami, Luftrausers, Gods Will Be Watching, The Expendabros, and of course rebooting another retro shooter, Shadow War, Warrior, getting 3 games out of that franchise so far. Machine Games asked Bethesda if they could make a video game for them to publish, and they said yes, but only if you choose from one of these 3 franchises, all 3 of them being, of course, classic shooters. Machine Games chose Wolfenstein, and 4 years later, Wolfenstein: The New Order was released to huge success, causing Bethesda to take the wretched Doom 4 that had been stuck in development hell for 5 years, shine up a new trailer, and release Doom in 2017. Wait, that's not right. Why did I mix that up? Oh, that's because in 2017, Bethesda published Prey, another game that had the brand of an existing game branded onto it by Bethesda. At least Doom still had the Caco Demon. And in probably one of the stupidest mistakes the writing team for Doom 2016 made, the game starts with the Doom Slayer punching the exposition man, cocking a shotgun, and walking out of the elevator. Let's pin that for a second. Finally, Night Dive Studios was founded because Stephen Kick couldn't play System Shock 2 on a modern PC, so he bought the IP, remade it for modern systems in 2012, and has basically for the last 12 years been remastering classic games. The only reason you can play these games on modern PCs without needing tons of mods is thanks to Stephen and Alex Kick. She was there from the start. Women can be autistically annoyed that video games don't work on modern PCs. Okay, so why am I telling you this? Well, clearly, all of these shifts are a huge influence on the direction games are going, not just in AAA, but in independent circles too. Thanks to how easy it is to make games, single developer games are no longer in the rarity. In indie circles, they're almost the norm. So cutting corners is inevitable to create a game to a high enough standard in a realistic time. So the length of the game is compromised, the fidelity of the game is compromised, maybe even features are removed. Of course, quality is key here, but one thing you can cut and get a lot of time back during development is the story. This is where we come back to the Doomslayer punching the monitor. This single cutscene was more damaging to the perception of story in video games than every single 12-hour Hideo Kojima cutscene rolled into one. The Doomslayer punching that monitor and everyone going, "Hell yeah, fuck exposition," fucked up every boomer shooter to come out afterwards, because roughly 100% of them figured, we don't need story at all then, throw it in the bin. I obviously cannot draw a direct line between that event and developers choosing that, but hey, that is what happened. Tons of boomer shooters afterwards are unbelievably willful in disregarding story, presumably fearing that it would, as implied by that cutscene, get in the way of gameplay. So I thought of some examples to give of ways to add story into your game, pleasing the lore weasels such as myself as well as the gameplay barbarians, because at least at this point we're all under the same understanding that adding story can help your game get even more recognition and more engagement. Number 1. Optional dialogue. Even in a linear game where optional dialogue does absolutely nothing, if you have a character speak, let them speak some more behind a hidden dialogue questions, or make the entire conversation optional to begin with. In some games, you can just talk to people and learn stuff about the world, and it's entirely non-mandatory. Heck, even take the statement optional dialogue literally. The entire Metro trilogy has roughly 297,000 hours of voice-acted conversations between random people throughout the entire franchise. You can quite literally listen to characters in-world talk for half an hour uninterrupted and learn things about the characters, their backstory, their personality, and the world at large. You could even sneak in gameplay tips like this guy does at the start of Metro Last Light, where he tells another guy that the swamp is dangerous because you just follow the red flags. And guess what? About 6 hours later, you encounter the swamp and his advice helped. You follow the red flags. I didn't have to listen to him, but because I did, I know more about the world and I feel smarter for it. Number 2. Logs. Probably the first ever mechanic in an FPS game where you could just find optionally more story. Logs. Just put books everywhere about in-world stuff. They don't have to be audio logs. They can just be people's diaries, last letters before their death, or a note taped to a broken window that says, "Fix it now, you piece of shit, or I destroy your baseball bat for good," which can tell a story about the dynamics of the people living in that world and that building. They don't even have to be other people. You could just find points where the character you're playing writes down a note about what just happened and what's gonna happen later, and how they're feeling about it. It's not much, but it's something. 3. Reward the player for listening to the plot. Hey, if your plot is discoverable, like either of the first two, you can trick your player into listening to them, by choice, by just rewarding them for doing so. Not just like giving hints like I mentioned earlier, but you can also like hide hints to secrets in the text, or just placing the diary of a dead coal miner next to that cool new laser gun they're going to be picking up. They might just read it and create a Pavlovian connection in their brain between getting loot and reading books, and you might reverse the child literacy crisis in America. Voiceover. If you really don't give a shit to put in any player freedom, you can just deliver the plot in fucking voiceover during gameplay. This is basically what Borderlands, System Shock, Prey, Bioshock, and most immersive sims that can justify having some form of headset does. You play the game and an ally, or fuck it, even an enemy, just exposits or just talks to you during the duration of the game. This is literally how the entire plot of Ghost Runner was delivered, and while people call the plot mid, you can't tell me defeating the architect at the end isn't enhanced because you know that the giant digital face you're flying towards at the end is a guy who lied to you and betrayed you. If you were somehow less engaged by that than no story, you must be an alien. 5. Just fucking text. If you can't be fucked to hire voice actors or put the plot in books for us to find, just put the plot in plain text in the menu with a little bit of pizzazz. Come on, you can literally just steal from Far Cry 3 and put in a bestiary or item description of locations and what they do, why they're here, and who you are and what you're doing. Hide it in a menu somewhere, I don't care. 6. Anything. Just literally fucking anything. Just do any form of indication of an actual story. You animated like 500 enemies for this game, right? Why not animate like one short 30-second cutscene that tells us a little bit about what the character is? Is he curious, reckless, angry, precise, flamboyant, clumsy, impatient? You can convey these things in animation, and I fucking know you can do that because you already animated an entire game full of animations already. Anything to tell me who I am, where I'm going, and why! The amount of games I have stopped playing because there is no context for what I am doing, who I am, or where I'm doing it is almost staggering. Surely I can't be the only one who thinks this way. I remember watching old reviews of SNES games from people like JonTron, and frequently in order to try to understand what's going on, he would go into the manual booklet to try to find the story. On Proteus's Kickstarter, which is probably the closest thing we'll get to a booklet, there's an About section. 53 words are dedicated to describing the fact that it's a boomer shooter. 50 words are dedicated to telling everyone about the level editor, which is a good feature. 77 words are dedicated to describing the purpose of the Kickstarter and the planned release date, and a measly 24 words are dedicated to the story. In our game, you play as a corrupted agent of Proteus, hell-bent on destroying your creator and everyone that gets in your way. Hate to tell you guys, but that's nothing. I don't know what a corrupted agent of Proteus is. I don't know why I'm destroying my creator. The start of the game looks like some form of invasion, and these hell demons don't really fit into a space base, so what's the deal with all that? You never learn in any way. Proteus isn't even really the worst offender. That would be Rot. Rot is a great game, and yes, that's the way I've decided to pronounce it because it's the most extra. It's a great game. It evokes a lot of the things that we remember as great from the late great 90s FPS games, reminding me in equal measure of Half-Life, Quake, and even a dash of immersive Sims with the movable boxes and interactable environments. The game is set in Czechoslovakia during the socialist period after what the Steam page, and the Steam page only, describes as an unspecified disaster in 1986, which gives the game its distinctly Stalker in the mid-90s feel, with enemies in gas masks, cultish hoods, fighting in brown, depressing industrial environments. You fight in the sewers, underground railway stations, old castles, forts, and even Grandma's house. Look, she baked you cookies. The game has a bunch of problems, brought on by the fact that it's trying to ape these classic games. For instance, the game doesn't autosave and has a set number of save slots, which isn't great, so saving can be a bit of a hassle if you don't want to stack your saves or use the quick save feature too much. Your main source of health is obviously health pickups, but unfortunately they can be outrageously far apart, making the game quite difficult. But what's kept me going is the world. It's an interesting world to set a game like this in, with the semi-supernatural enemies mixed in with the strange people. Except The entire time I'm waiting for just a tiny bit of a story the entire time, so that all of this comes together. Because as I play it, it just sort of... None of it's actually ever explained, as, you might expect. Once again, if you want to learn the story, you have to read the Steam page. You start in a civil defense shelter deep under a Prague metro station. As a proud holder of the military readiness badge, you know what your duty is. Put on a non-functioning gas mask, load the VZ-52 pistol, and protect the peace of your socialist homeland from the strange intruders. That is an excellent piece of dark humor and world building. If you wanted answers as to why the world is the way it is, then too bad. Who the invaders are? Too bad. Why everyone's wearing gas masks? Too bad. Every single level containing small tidbits about the world on pictures or pieces of text. There's world building, but there's never enough to give a complete image. The game's locations are heavily inspired by real history and real locations in Prague, and that's always been my favorite way to write a story. My 3 million word D&D world is filled with inspiration from real Viking history and myth. But it's not a start, it's just all there is. You never find out who you are, why you were in the civil defense shelter, or why you're alone in your entirety. Now, while you could fill the blanks there, what you do is also entirely vague. Defend the homeland doesn't have a clear objective, and I'm not asking for waypoints here, I'm asking for any guidance or motivation of any kind. There's this corpse of an astronaut that appears in every level of the game. What's the deal with that? What does that mean? Is it a nod to Soviet cosmological history? The fact that they had every single first when it came to space, apart from landing on the moon? And the fact that Russians are the only people to have ever died in space? I actually found a tweet from the creator of the game implying that at least that image of the astronaut was one of the people who was working together on one of the spaceships, and the other person who is visible in the mural in the background was the backup for the Soyuz 11. I think I'm getting that right. The spaceship that blew up in the atmosphere. And he was the backup and he narrowly dodged it. So this being an alternate reality, is that a nod to that? But then I realized I was digging too far. No, it's just a dead astronaut. There's not enough in the game to actually bridge that connection. That's overanalysis. There's not enough in the game to bridge the connection between that tweet I saw scrolling through his Twitter account for an hour and the game itself. There just isn't enough. There's not enough there. It doesn't really mean anything. Story is essential, especially after Half-Life changed the course of gaming. It's just about whether it comes from the player or the developer, like I said. And in a linear, level-to-level game, the story can only come from the developer. Rot shows the developer has a clear and obvious talent with both comedy and writing, given all of the funny gags left in the background and the genuinely nice world building. But none of it is actually utilized to make a good story, which is such a shame. There's a lot of gorgeous fan art from amazingly talented artists, and I can only imagine how much more there would be if the protagonist had an inch of characterization, or the story had just a bit of details, or there was any form of actual villain, or if there was a goal to fight against, or really any indication of a narrative. Think about the avalanche of morons who draw fan art about the dogshit story in Modern Warfare.
You may as well take my heart, Simon. It's already full of you.
Please, go.
What is it? What's wrong, my dear?
You know nothing about me. You've known me only 3 weeks.
3 weeks? Simon, I've known you all my life.
All your life?
It's true. When I've heard beautiful music, I've thought you'd like...
Yes, I did bring up that smut art for this reason. Oh well. So I suppose it can't be helped. This is a hard position to hold. Trust me, I've gotten a lot of pushback talking to my friends about the script for this video and the concept for this video, but I still think it's an important, nuanced point. And it's very important to note that not even films had a story in it to begin with. And this is my argument, I guess. Imagine someone taking the guy who filmed Train Arriving at a Station, one of the first ever films, and asking him 10 years afterwards, or even 5 years afterwards, whether story and narrative should be in films, or rather that it should be narrative, or that it should be a requirement. And then that guy goes, no, I believe story is left for books and theater. This new technology is meant only for visual entertainment. You would have no way to deliver dialogue, for instance, since it's only visual and there's no sound. And that guy would be wrong, because the entire film industry and the Oscars and the Academy Awards, and since the 1920s forwards to the today, for 100 years, film has been renowned for being this amazing thing with dialogue and narrative and story, and that's what film is now. And in my opinion, video games are such a new technology that back in the 90s, when FPS games had only just started to exist, the concept of inserting story into them was so new, people didn't necessarily think it had to be that way. Because back then it was, children's games like Mario, and it was arcade games, pure entertainment, not art or an experience. But it's hard to not realize that we've changed and become different. Now, this final part here wasn't going to be talking about ROT initially. Thankfully, the point I wanted to make, that this is a widespread issue, is widespread, so I could just have a different game. There was always going to be an example, but I was going to originally talk about Wrath: Aeon of Ruin as the worst example of this problem. An utterly gorgeous, complex, deep, and interesting love letter to Quake that is itself an amazingly complex world. However, there is no story outside of this short paragraph on the Steam store page. You have a book that has no story in it, and there is no narrative tying this world together at all. It's beautiful and interesting, and seems to have this a lot of lore behind it, but there is no actual story in the game. You just show up and, on the basis of this paragraph on the Steam store page, you kill hundreds of demons. However, in the middle of production of this video, the Steam blog for the game updated. I have been proven correct once again, where I've spotted a trend, and one of the core games I was going to talk about in the video course corrected during the production of the video, or before and announced it during the production of the video. If you don't believe me, here's a screenshot of the document when I added the start to the ending rant about Wrath: Aeon of Ruin, dated December 5th, with the community post coming on January 2nd. I actually went through all the Steam community posts to make sure I didn't miss anything, and they actually announced a story, and I just happened to never see it. I even found this old roadmap from 2019 that, as you can see, doesn't include any mention of the story being added. And just because I'm paranoid, I look through all subsequent Steam blog posts, and none of the updates mention any fully fleshed story being added, not even the updated roadmaps. By the time of at least April of last year, one of the central characters of the story, the Shepherd of Wayward Souls, was represented only as a statue in the game. While I may have missed some interview clip where they say they're saving the story until the end of development, none of that's clear from the early blog posts, roadmaps, or anything reasonable that I would have read before this video was being made. So, for the sake of argument, it does seem like they either followed my exact advice or my exact philosophy on this type of stuff, leaving the story until the end of the development of the game, when you have all your gameplay and all your levels, so you know what you're going to do for the story. It's too bad I can't claim ownership over that change in direction, as this video didn't release before the blog post. For shame. So either I'm right and leaving story creation towards the end of development is the correct approach, or I'm also right and this is a problem that the developers themselves noticed, either from feedback or their own playtests. It's still a deviation for most boomer shooters as a whole that generally have as a minimal story as possible. So while I'm mad that I've had to rewrite the entire end to instead slander a ROT, I'm glad to be proven right once again. It's like cocaine to me. I fucking love it. It's also worth noting that it really does feel like they read my fucking doc for this video, because Wrath has gone on to add every single thing I mentioned earlier as a simple, unobtrusive way to add story to your game, with optional logs in the form of notes and optional dialogue through the Shepherd of Wayward Souls. I wonder if he's voice acted. That'd be cool. I guess to wrap this up, now that it's been derailed, I'm just going to say that while nostalgia can be an amazing inspiration, and while the aesthetics of old games can be both appealing and a massive time saver for smaller devs, it's important not to forget the ideological changes that have happened since those aesthetics were a technological requirement and not just a choice. Put story in your games. The extra month of development to add the minimal amount of story I think is enough to make your game transcend your initial market is worth it. It's important that we don't wear the rose-tinted glasses too tightly, or you'll look like a cunt and have stupid circles around your eyes, and the glass will push into your eyeballs and blind you, causing you to make foolish decisions. Wait, that made it into the script?